Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books presents Bitter Legacy by Dal Maclean, narrated by Gary Furlong. 1. It wasn't exactly a usual place to have your throat cut. Not that there were set venues for it, but Cheval Place in Knightsbridge had to be about as far from non-metaphorical throat-cutting country as it got. James parked his car behind an open-doored ambulance and looked around carefully as he stepped out into the damp London night air. The quiet, innocuous, very expensive cul-de-sac sat tucked away behind the flashy roar of Brompton Road. On one side an elegantly painted Georgian mews terrace, on the other a red brick monstrosity of doubtful lineage. Now, though, two silent blue flashing patrol cars disfigured the subdued wealth of the street. Garish yellow crime scene tape cordoned off a large area of the pavement in front of a shiny black front door. All very vulgar. James opened the boot of his Honda and dug into the plastic box of equipment there, full of tools, polythene bags, and a white forensic containment suit, which he awkwardly shouldered into. For his muscular 6'1" frame, the suits never seemed big enough. The final touches were paper overshoes and a pair of violently lilac nitrile surgical gloves. Then he pulled up the suit hood to cover his thick, light hair. James didn't recognize the uniformed PC standing in front of the house, so he flashed his warrant card before ducking under the tape across the entrance, onto the single front step. That was as far as he needed to go to find the reason for the call-out. A woman lay sprawled face down in the hall, her feet close to the door. Silky, dark, shoulder-length hair obscured most of her face, and stuck to the large pool of coagulating scarlet beneath her upper body. Her coat and skirt were tangled at the top of her thighs, but from where James stood her black tights didn't appear to have been interfered with. "Evening, Samira." Detective Constable Samira Kaur stood near the head of the corpse, strong, handsome features peering out from her own white paper hood. She'd proved to be one of the best DCs they had, a Sikh girl from Birmingham, desperately in love with the job. "Evening, Sarge," she returned. "Looking very nifty. You should wear that on the telly." "Uh-huh. Can't help noticing we have the same stylist. What have you got?" "There's no sign of forced entry. Seems like she opened her front door and the assailant subdued her from behind, then slashed her throat." Kaur had a strong Midlands accent, her tone never less than imperturbable. "No sign of significant struggle. Probably quick." "Who found her?" "A neighbour. Wally's calming her down. She noticed the door a little ajar around." Kaur consulted a small black notebook. 19:30 on her way to Brompton Road. Then again just before 2000 before she got back. She left it for a while, then decided to take a nose around. James nodded toward the corpse on the floor. "Any clue to identity?" Kaur consulted her notebook again. "The neighbour says the house owner's Maria Curzon-Whyte. Same name on the driver's license and the ID in a bag." So, James calculated, time of death would have been sometime before 7:30, and probably after dark. And in London, in February, it got dark by 5. He frowned down at the dead woman, at the huge bright red peony of blood sinking obscenely into the pile of her expensive cream hall carpet. Not a cat's chance now of making his flat viewing, he thought resentfully, and at once decent guilt scurried in behind. From the start he'd sworn to himself that the job would never make him callous. But here he was, annoyed at someone for having the gall to get murdered when he had other plans. "Robbery?" he asked levelly. "Haven't seen any signs so far," Kaur replied. "Her bag and briefcase are still there and they seem undisturbed." And indeed both were lying further into the hall, as if they'd been flung there when the woman fell. They appeared expensive, like the woman's clothes, like the house. Maybe it would be a nice, straightforward domestic. Most murders were. James crouched lower, careful not to lean too close to the body, in case some of his DNA, a hair or a skin particle, contaminated it. And as he did so, he noticed something, an object, lying close to the woman's head, caught in the shadow of the hallway wall. "What's that?" Kaur peered down. "Yeah, I saw it. It's a piece of chain." Heavy duty, a short length of steel chain with no lock at either end. James chewed his lip thoughtfully. It most likely had nothing to do with this. It appeared far too short to have been of any use to strangle or subdue the victim, and too sturdy to have broken without extreme force. But anything was possible in this game. He'd learned that quickly enough. "Okay." James straightened and sidled round the body to join Kaur. careful to walk on the same thin edge of carpet as she had. Let's see what we can turn up before herself gets here. He found an incredibly narrow house, like a very tall flat, old and quirky, and set on 3 levels. The basement held a study, the ground floor a sitting room with a TV and a generously sized, scrupulously clear aquarium, a tiny kitchen and toilet, and there were 2 modest bedrooms on the top floor. In reality it was cramped, but James knew it would set a buyer back a couple of £1 million at least, in this part of town. You paid through the nose to have Harrods as your corner shop. Books lined the small basement study, and an open antique roll-top desk rested against the wall opposite the door, the top of it laden with framed photographs. Most of them featured a dark-haired girl, posing with what appeared to be a well-heeled family, sitting astride an impressive grey horse, grinning joyfully in her graduation robes. She looked interesting somehow, James thought. Intelligent, challenging, and oddly familiar. He frowned down at the photographs for some time, wrestling with that sense of vague recognition, but the longer he stared, the further away it seemed to slip. He began to study the paperwork piled neatly on the desk. It became evident almost immediately what the woman had done for a living, and with the realization came a needle-sharp stab of apprehension. There were case notes, a pile of opened letters addressed to Maria Curzon-Whyte at her chambers, and now James paid more attention to them, mainly law books on the shelves. She'd been relatively young to be a criminal barrister, though just leafing through her correspondence, he got the impression of a sharp mind, of extreme competence. But for all they prettied it up with gowns and horsehair wigs, someone wading in the sewers, just like him. There were so many more possibilities now he didn't know whether to feel excited or appalled. He blew out a tense breath and extracted his phone from his jacket pocket to take some detailed shots of the desk before the SOCO team arrived. But as he did, he spotted the corner of a small white notepad sticking out from underneath the pile of case notes. He crouched down and edged part of it toward him carefully with a nitrile-covered forefinger. It was blank, the kind of sticky-backed pad hotels provided for their guests, and sure enough, he could see the edge of a brand logo on it. Ideas and wild speculations darted into his mind as he began to maneuver it out. Forbidden liaisons, seedy affairs, murderous consequences. He moved his phone close, hopefully to photograph the pad as it slid out. Raffles in Singapore. He sighed heavily and lowered the phone. Definitely a bit far to go for a shag. But as he moved his head back and started to rise, the light fell on the top page of the pad in a certain way, and he could see an obvious indent. Whatever had been written above it had been written heavily. He didn't even have to rub a pencil over it, just as well because forensics would have eviscerated him if he'd tried. He just had to squint at it from the right angle. He copied what he'd found into the notebook. An address in London. It could be anything, of course, a hairdresser, a nail salon, the place her murderer lived, with the murder weapon conveniently placed for easy discovery by an enterprising detective sergeant. He gave a huff of dark amusement and straightened up from the desk. Maria's excited eyes met his, blazing dark and happy, triumphant at her graduation, her whole brilliant, glittering life laid out in front of her, like a carpet of flowers. She smiled at him expectantly, with all the blind arrogance of beauty and youth, daring him not to admire her. He wanted to smile back. He felt a sudden unwelcome tug of emotion, almost of loss. "How the fuck did you end like that, Maria?" he asked those clever eyes. "Jamie, anything?" James drew in a quick, shocked breath and whirled around. His detective chief inspector, also known as herself, stood in the doorway, looking exactly like a woman who'd just hurtled halfway across London on a Sunday to attend one murder scene, a stabbing outside a nightclub in Vauxhall, then been required to turn and hurtle back to this one. She wore a white forensic suit too, but the hood remained down, revealing her disastrously disordered corkscrew curls. She raised a mocking eyebrow at James's badly covered startlement, and he could only shrug wryly in acknowledgement. They got on well, he and Joe Ingham. She was a small, plump, half-Jamaican woman in her 40s from Essex, with a gratifyingly foul mouth, a husband in the force, and no kids. Everyone knew she could easily have reached a higher rank if she'd wished. She had more than enough intelligence and political savvy. But she had no real desire to climb any further up the greasy pole. She wanted to solve crimes. James knew that, having come up the hard way herself, Ingham could easily have disdained a fast-track recruit like him, but she'd chosen to nurture his potential. In turn, he felt a fierce loyalty to her, drawn to her no-nonsense decency like a moth to the light. "Mum, assuming she's the resident, she seems to have lived alone, and she was a criminal barrister." Ingham glanced at one of the photographs on the desk behind James, closed her eyes and blew out a despairing breath. Inevitably this would be high profile. A young, beautiful, rich, professional woman involved in the criminal justice system, murdered brutally on her own doorstep. And more than that, a woman very probably personally known to crime reporters. Most of all, though, the important words for the front pages would be beautiful and rich. "Shit," she spat. James grimaced in solidarity. Everyone in the South Kensington murder investigation team knew the kind of pressure Ingham laboured under, the grinding politics of trying to make a case against budget cutbacks, like every other head of an MIT in London. Unfortunately, though, the argument for any murder team would always be tricky to make. As part of the West London group of MITs, Ingham's unit took a week's turn on call for the whole West London area, and in that week any unexplained deaths on that patch became their cases. But that meant that, by the luck of the draw, their unit at existing levels, roughly 30 strong, could be alternately worked to exhaustion or stultifyingly bored. Impossible to predict. Just that afternoon, James and his fellow DS, Alex Scrivener, had been bitching in their dead office like a pair of adolescents on a message board, all about how fucking unlucky the unit had been with their last turns on call, how the famine and homicide had been telling on morale, and much-needed overtime, how bored they were working files on dead cases. They'd been reduced to throwing darts at an ancient board propped against a waste bin. Now, on their first night of their on-call week, they had 2 murders to solve. Ingham had no time, and James understood too well the wisdom of the old warning to be careful what you wished for. He followed Ingham silently, almost guiltily, up past scenes of crime officers hovering around the corpse, and outside, 2 doors along the damp, now grotesquely busy mews, to the woman who discovered the body. Mrs. Alex Cordiner sat perched at the edge of a pristine Chesterfield sofa in her fantastically elegant, expensively scented lounge. A fine-boned, exquisitely groomed woman of indeterminate age, she appeared to be exactly the kind of person who could afford to live in Cheval Place. "Mrs. Cordiner?" The woman glanced up from her dazed contemplation of a half-full cup of tea to regard Ingham with large, watery eyes. "I understand that you must be very upset." Mrs. Cordiner let loose a snort of desperate amusement. Ingham continued, unperturbed. "But perhaps you can tell us what happened." "I didn't know her," Alice Cordiner said at once. Her cultured voice sounded thin and high and defensive, as if she were making an excuse for unpardonable behaviour. "Well, just to say hello to. You know how it is. I used to see her coming and going." "Did she have a partner?" Ingham's voice remained conversational. "I don't know." But then, almost compulsively, "She had some visitors, men and women." "But you saw no one around tonight?" "No. I just saw the door open on my way to Marks and Spence, you know, on Brompton Road. There were no lights on, and normally, well, one doesn't like to be nosy, but it would have been an invitation to theft. Or maybe she'd actually been burgled. So I pushed the door, but I could feel something behind it." She lifted a thin, trembling hand to her mouth, breathing becoming more audible, incipient hysteria, barely banished and slithering back in at the edges. "And when I put my head around, I have a torch on my phone. There was so much blood, and it seemed so bright. I didn't know it would be such a bright red. On the television, it's—" She visibly forced herself to stop, shaking fingers pressed tight against her lips. "Did you notice anything?" James put in gently. "Anything unusual? Any detail, however small, that might be of help?" "God, I just saw her, lying there, and I ran." She paused, a few shuddering seconds. Then she offered to James, tearfully, hopefully. "I did notice she had on Jimmy Choo's new season." James didn't allow his expression to change. Shock did things to people, and he'd asked. "You've been very helpful, Mrs. Cordiner," James reassured her. She nodded sharply, like a shocked bird, then dropped her eyes back to the safe familiarity of her tea. As James and Ingham walked back slowly to the now bustling crime scene, they were both subdued. "No magic bullet, then?" James ventured, just to break the silence. "I'll stop believing in Santa when I turn 35, Ingham snapped. "I'm not sure what I'll do if the tooth fairy isn't—" She made a hugely impatient sound. "Fuck! We're not going to get much breathing space on this one." James nodded wordlessly. But then, as suddenly as if she'd hit a wall, Ingham stopped walking. James, startled, stopped too, a few feet from the scene of crime tape. She faced him full on, all her focus on him. Her eyes were large and dark, slightly protuberant, and the expectant light in them made James's gut clench nervously. "How does it feel to you?" Ingham asked, and James realized he'd been waiting for exactly that question, in exactly that tone. How it felt to him. Because, much to his own embarrassment, the leaps of intuition and logic he'd made in the past, which had paid off, had earned James a worrying reputation with Ingham, and Scrivener for that matter, as somehow a bit psychic. That unnerved him more than a bit. He appreciated the fact that Ingham took his opinion into account, but even the way she had phrased the question felt redolent of crystal balls and communing with the spirits. All he'd ever done was go with logic in his gut feeling, which had been a new experience for a man brought up to fit into a very tight box. Feelings hadn't been welcome in his house. Still, he tried to give her what he could, how it felt, to him. Not a domestic, not at first glance. No sense it's a robbery. As far as we can tell, no obvious sexual motive. Ingham didn't say a word, just waited. "Domestic," James went on. "Well, it'd have to be someone in her life who planned it. Someone so full of rage, he or she would watch Maria get out of her car and unlock the door, then grab her and cut her throat on the spot. That's a really intimate way of killing someone. Unless you're a pro, you'd have to hate her. But I didn't get a feeling of rage, just the one wound." Ingham nodded slowly. "So?" He shrugged, hating that he had so little. "Someone just needed her dead. It could still be domestic, but I take your point. Her job has to be the best lead," Ingham frowned. "Prevention or vengeance?" A short, tense pause, and she seemed to be bracing herself. "Jamie, I'm going to need you to take the lead on this one." James stilled and stared at her blankly. He'd heard the words clearly enough, but he couldn't be sure he'd understood them all the same. He was a detective sergeant, far down the pecking order. More than that, he was the least experienced DS in their unit. He couldn't take the lead on a major investigation. Ingham grimaced. "Look, I know it's asking a lot, and yeah, I could shift D.I. Mulligan from the Albert Embankment stabbing, but I really get the feeling this one's going to be a bastard." James gazed at her wordlessly, and her mouth twisted. "Fuck! Don't look at me like that. I'm not hanging you out to dry. It's still my case. But I'm not going to be able to do the legwork, and there's no one I trust more to dig out the obscure details. You've a copper's nose, Jamie." "But," James protested weakly, "Alec—" Because Scrivener had more than 2 decades' experience over him. In fact, he'd shown James the ropes as a detective. "I need Alec to manage the office, with 2 cases going," Ingham said. "I know it's unorthodox, but you'll be a DI soon enough, and frankly, I've got no options. I know you can do it. Just don't go off half-cocked. Come to me with everything you get." She waited expectantly for a second or two. Then, with a gusty sigh, she strode off toward the forensics team, working, efficiently silent, in the eerie, winking blue light. To James, that sigh felt like a reproach. He watched her edge inside the hallway, but he found himself slowing deliberately, then stopping, trying to wrestle down his warring emotions. Had she expected more enthusiasm? That he'd be gung-ho at the unprecedented chance she'd decided to give him? He'd only been a copper for 2 and a bit years, and he'd been a uniformed PC for 1 of them. All his time at the MIT had basically involved acting as Ingham's sidekick. Exactly the role detective sergeants were meant to play. Bag carriers, organisers, assistants, sounding boards. Now Ingham expected him to coordinate a major murder case with no formal acknowledgement and no rank to back him up. He drew a deep breath, trying to calm himself down. It could be ruinous. And yet, hadn't Ingham also paid him a huge compliment? She could have moved him to the straightforward stabbing case in Vauxhall, but she'd left that with a senior officer and chosen James to shoulder the hardcore investigation. Rationally, her head would be on the chopping block too. Fuck. At times like this, James wished bitterly that he smoked. He gazed restlessly along the mews, noting lights were now on in most of the houses, but then anyone would find it bloody hard to sleep through the aftermath of a murder. All the residents would have to be interviewed anyway, as soon as possible. Deliberately he relaxed his shoulders and moved to follow Ingham. He felt almost comically far from fully engaged now, but even so, as he neared Maria's door, something made him glance to the left, into the deep shadows outside the semicircle of powerful lights shining on the crime scene. It took a second to register, but as he peered into the gloom, he saw a slightly darker blob a few feet away, almost closer to the neighbor's door. He thought his eyes were probably playing tricks on him, but he strode over to investigate anyway, glad of the diversion. What he discovered, when he shone his phone torch on it, proved a total anticlimax. A small bag of pebbles rested pointlessly against the house wall, clear polythene tied at the top with an elastic band and filled with smooth, white, sea-washed stones. James frowned, almost offended by it, trying to make sense of its presence in a London side street. Maybe someone had left the stones for Maria's fish tank, or maybe they had nothing to do with her. Maybe they belonged to her neighbour, or the building work going on in the house a few doors down. He told Soko to document the bag anyway, since this seemed to be his case now. Then the diversion ended. Grimly he watched an officer photographing the bag and another dabbing it for fingerprints. And when Ingham reappeared, he managed to find a smile for her before they headed to their respective cars to drive the short distance to the station. James followed Ingham into the station briefing room just after 1 a.m., and the contrast from the peaceful state in which he'd left it felt staggering. From 0 to full, reckless throttle in just a few hours. Ingham headed straight for Detective Inspector Mulligan, holding forth at the far side of the room to Charlie Brent, his unfortunate DS, and when he saw her, Mulligan snapped to attention before her like a squaddy on parade. James watched and felt a bolstering stab of contempt, because fuck it, whatever the restrictions of leading an investigation with his present rank and inexperience, he knew he could do a better job than Mulligan, a career cop so pedantic and ponderous that James had come close to committing homicide himself on a few occasions he'd worked for him. The Albert Embankment case, Mulligan's case, rested on CCTV and the hope of eyewitness cooperation. Maria's would be a mystery, James could feel it, real old-fashioned detective work, and then the remnants of civilian shame tempered that burst of professional excitement, and curdled in with that, realism. He had to get it right, not just for Ingham, or even himself, but for Maria, for the people who loved her. He didn't want to end up as one of those old cops with a filing cabinet full of the guilty souvenirs of failure. He tore his gaze away from Mulligan and Ingham, and with a jolt of relief, found Scrivener sitting off to one side, looking as if he'd been running his hands through his sparse hair for hours. It stood up in tiny tufts now, like the feathers of a pissed-off owl. Alec was old school, a big, ginger, balding, mustachioed Glaswegian in his late 40s, who'd come up through the ranks over 28 years to the plum job of DS in an MIT. He'd spent his entire adult life in London, yet his Glasgow accent hadn't softened by a syllable. He and James were polar opposites, yet they fitted together like puzzle pieces. Within the MIT, they were their own mini-unit. "Like fucking buses," Scrivener sniffed, as James slid into the seat beside him. "Nothing till you've given up, and then two come along at once, and then it's crazy town." James huffed a laugh. "It could be worse. We could be Charlie," Scrivener grunted with amused malice. "Poor bastard." They sat in silent accord as the rest of the unit shuffled and gossiped in the seats and tables around them, waiting with eager tension for Ingham to begin the show. And as they waited, James worried at how to tell Scrivener he'd been chosen to lead a murder investigation with just one single year's CID experience behind him. It wasn't that Scrivener had ever showed a molecule of resentment of James and the way he'd been parachuted in from the outside. He'd always been totally accepting of the fact that DS, to whom he'd once shown the ropes, would be a detective inspector soon, when he'd never had that option, when it had taken him 16 years of hard slog to make sergeant. James had been in awe of his generosity, but Scrivener had confided that the endless reforms imposed by the Met since he'd joined had long since left him ready to accept his career could be leapfrogged by an influx of prima ballerinas at any moment. But still, "Any joy with finding a flat?" Scrivener asked idly. James accepted the escape, though he couldn't call it a restful subject either. Not so far. There are 20 people after every decent room. He tried to sound unbothered, but in reality, before this case hit, he'd been maniacally dedicated to the project of reclaiming a life for himself. Only, London hadn't been cooperating, and now work had kicked him in the bollocks too. It had all been sparked 6 weeks before, by one of those epiphanies that usually came in the dead hours of the night. This one, though, had come with James's alarm clock. It had woken him in his lumpy single bed, and he'd stared at the brown-stained paint on the bedroom ceiling, smelled the eternal stink of cabbage, heavily underlaid by damp, and all at once he'd felt as if he was suffocating. It had been a quick, terrifying surge of panic that had sent his heart rate galloping, triggered by one of those too clear-sighted moments no one wanted to have. The realization that he had no life anymore, no real friends. He had nothing outside of work because work had become his one refuge and certainty. Being a good policeman provided all his self-belief and pride. At 28 he existed and little more, in a rented hovel of a bedsit, furnished with landlord's tat. And he didn't even need to. Poverty hadn't forced him this low. He didn't have to live like a hermit in a cell. He didn't have to smell fucking cabbage all the time. What he'd done, what he was, didn't actually require a hair shirt. It had been a ludicrous kind of insight. He hadn't even been aware he'd been hiding. But once the awakening had come, his need to get out of that flat had grown manic. "I've seen 14 already," James confided gloomily. "I had a viewing tomorrow in Earl's Court as well. It looked good." Scrivener's bushy ginger eyebrows headed toward his receding hairline. "Earl's Court? I remember when that was affordable." "No, this one's pretty reasonable," James protested. "That's why I'm so pissed off I'm going to miss a chance at it." But deep down he knew he'd have gone for something more modest if the wording of the advert hadn't pulled him in. Wanted, flatmate for 2-bed, first floor in South Kensington. Parking, can be male or female. Must be employed, solvent, civil, gay-friendly. Well, he'd thought at the time, excitement beginning to buzz. He fit all of them. Most importantly, he fit the last bit. It had been a major part of James's resolution to change after all, forcing himself to finally try. Make his publicly accepted sexuality more than theory. Make some gay friends for a start. So much for that. Scrivener seemed to sense his need to sulk, so they both silently watched Ingham as she finished her finessing of Mulligan and called the briefing to order. She rattled through the nightclub stabbing without calling Mulligan to make any kind of contribution. Obviously her focus lay with the bigger case. "Right, the second one tonight. Cheval Place, our own backyard. We're treating the house as the primary crime scene until we know different. Going by ID, the victim appears to be Maria Curzon-Whyte, age 25, a barrister at Blackheath Chambers." A loud collective groan echoed around the room. They all knew how the press operated. Ingham ignored them. "She lived alone, but she may have had boyfriends or indeed girlfriends. Samira and Wally have started door-to-door. We haven't got a time of death yet, but the assailant used a risky method. Body left right in the front hall of a Mews house, with the door ajar. Jamie, get me a name and address for the next of kin. Barry, find as much info as possible about her chambers." She rattled off more tasks and directions, then stalked off to her office. James realized only at that moment that he hadn't seen her crack a smile in days. The briefing broke up with a cacophony of scraping chairs and chatter, and everyone trailed down the corridor to the big open-plan office come incident room, bleak and grey and filled with ragged furniture and Stone Age equipment. James's and Scrivener's battered chipboard desks were set out face-to-face in a small island, both half covered with ancient, bulky computer monitors normal people would have laughed at. James automatically switched on his monitor when he reached his rickety swivel chair, and as he sat down, he pressed the button on a massive, even more elderly computer beside his legs. On a very good day it took just 10 minutes to power up, and he had it lucky. Some of the terminals in the office took half an hour to come on. Scrivener had appropriated this one for James on the quiet, one of the many things he'd done to subtly help him since he'd arrived, though Scrivener'd be appalled to be called on it. "Fuck. What I wouldn't give for a cost of coffee right now." Scrivener thumped down a pile of files. "And a muffin." He grinned at James slyly. "All you overprivileged English bastards should come with a butler." James made his eyes expressionless. to go to get Costa for us," Scrivener finished innocently.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?